Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sheri delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'm your host, Sheri Few, and I have another great show for you today. Joining me is Kemberlee Kaye, a leading voice in the fight against ideological bias in academia. Kemberlee's work with the Legal Insurrection Foundation has been instrumental in exposing the hidden agenda behind many of the policies and initiatives in our schools and universities. From tackling critical race theory to defending academic freedom, we'll discuss how her team is working tirelessly to hold institutions accountable and push back against the growing tide of indoctrination. Before I bring her on, please give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up and subscribe to the show. And be sure to visit uspie.org to learn more and to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. US PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from US parents involved in education, connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. Joining me today is Kemberlee Kaye, Senior Contributing Editor at the Legal Insurrection Foundation. Kemberlee is a graduate of Texas A&M University and has a background in immigration law as a grassroots organizer and as a digital media strategist. Over the years, Kemberlee has worked with FreedomWorks, Americans for Prosperity, Project Veritas, and Senate election campaigns. In her work with the Legal Insurrection Foundation, Kemberlee serves as the managing editor for criticalrace.org. Kemberlee Kaye, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to spend some time visiting with you today. And I do apologize. I'm a little bit of a sore throat today, so do the best that I can.
Well, I appreciate you joining us despite the sore throat. You're a real trooper. So I'm really excited about the work that your team has been doing. And they've been in the forefront of exposing discrimination in higher education. So can you share a recent example where legal insurrection's work led to a tangible policy change or legal victory?
So there have been quite a few of these. Without going too far into the weeds, I'll give you the Cliff's Notes version of who we are and what we do and kind of how we came about. So I've actually been working with Professor Jacobson, who is our president and founder, for almost 11 years now. And when I started with him, we just had the Legal Insurrection blog. And it's back when the internet landscape, especially on the right, was a vastly different place. And so we would blog, we would plug away, we would really dig into things. So that's always kind of been our bread and butter, is to dig beyond the headlines. I used to joke that my beat on the blog was, well, actually, because there would be a headline that even people on the right might latch onto and run with. And then I would just start doing some basic fact checking and find that it wasn't accurate and it wasn't true. So anyway, we had the blog for quite a while and then just decided that we really wanted to take things to the next level. And we wanted to be able to dig in even deeper. And so we kind of rolled everything into a nonprofit entity so that we could raise more money to hire researchers to dig in even deeper than what we were doing kind of on a surface level in the blog. And that's how the Legal Insurrection Foundation came to be. And so from there, this was during the COVID years, we decided to look into all of the CRT, the critical race training or critical race theory activities happening on college campuses. So this was also around the time when parents who had their kids in government schools or public education were awakening to the fact that their kids were learning things that they really weren't keen on their children being taught, and that much of the education was not focused around functional education, but was all of this other ideological stuff. So we had this whole body of research. We turned it into a database, which we still maintain. We started off, I think, with 125 schools. We now have over 700. schools there that we regularly update and maintain. We've looked at the top business schools. We've looked at the top medical schools. We've looked at veterinary schools and military academies and all of the DEI, that whole universe, that acronym universe, and things that are happening on college campuses there. And we've moved into original reporting there too, where we had a very large report last year where we looked at how these offices on college campuses are rebranding DEI. And that's something we've actually been monitoring very closely for the past couple of years. So with the work on the CRT project, it's been instrumental and very helpful to state policymakers. We do work with them on occasion if they're working on legislation, or if we find something particularly disturbing, to let them know, hey, by the way, are you aware that this is happening at a publicly funded university in your state? Also, what are you going to do about it? But our work was mentioned in a congressional resolution, kind of as a gold standard for and as evidence for the activities that were happening on campus. And that happened a couple years ago. So I have many more examples in our next project, which is the Equal Protection Project. And that one came to be because when we first launched criticalrace.org, we were flooded with information or tips or people just desperately reaching out to us, wanting us to help, and they might be students or professors. And we've traditionally on the blog and as a foundation have worked with teachers and professors who were being maligned before cancel culture was even a thing, for saying things like there's only two genders. And so we would work with them to tell their story and really elevate it to the national stage, which then ultimately put pressure on the institutions that were allowing this kind of egregious behavior. So with all of the tips that we were receiving, we wanted to be able to do something. And that's where I'm always very passionate. I don't like to complain about a problem. I don't just want to talk about a problem. I want to solve the problem. And it's something I tell my children all the time. Come to me with a solution. Don't complain to me about the problem. If you really can't find the solution, I will help you there. But let's make sure we're keeping this in the right focus here. And so we then created the Equal Protection Project. And that became the mechanism by which we take action against discriminatory programs. And so we do many different types of legal action there. And most of what we do is legal action, whether it's complaints through the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which is a particularly helpful mechanism because we don't have to have a named plaintiff in order to file a complaint. And so if you know anything about how the left operates, if you have a whistleblower that comes forward and says, hey, there's a problem here, I'm seeing waste, fraud, and abuse. If this person happens to be situated in the left side ideologically, they're hailed by the media and everyone else as a brave hero. If they are anywhere else other than the left, they will try and destroy this person, their family, their career, their lives, and anything and everything they can get their hands on. So the mechanism that allows us to file complaints on basically just alleging and stating that these programs are discriminatory without a named plaintiff is tremendously helpful for us. We also send demand letters. We have a couple of lawsuits pending currently and many more in development. We have one in particular in the state of New York where there was a program, and this is in the K through 12 space. There's a program that's a college preparatory program. And of course, the qualifications to participate in the program vary depending on your race and ethnicity, and we actually had a group of parents band together because for certain demographics, there were no income thresholds, but for other demographics, there were. And that's not right. You can't just limit programs based on the color of the participant's skin. This is a direct violation of the Constitution. Like, this is a very black and white area of law. It's not something in which there's just a boatload of wiggle room. So we file many complaints there, and we've had to date, I think our last numbers we have filed. So, and just for reference, the Equal Protection Project is just 2 years old. I think we filed close to 70 complaints so far. And of those, we still have many pending, but I think we have, I want to say 15 what we would call successes, where either programs have been forced to change, they're currently under federal investigation. And so with the work that we do on the Equal Protection Project and even on the Critical Race Project, because when we publish these reports about what colleges are doing, and we did one at the end of the year last year where I thought it would be interesting because I live in Texas, and I think many people are under the misapprehension that this kind of stuff doesn't happen as often in the South. And while that's partially true, it's not 100% true, because some of the craziest things that we see and that I have seen over the years come from tiny town, middle of nowhere, right? And oftentimes those are tiny town and somewhere in the southern regions. And so I thought it would be very interesting to look at the southern states, or not the southern states, just states that took some kind of legislative or executive action against DEI, against CRT in higher education. So we looked at those states, we looked at the legislative or whatever action they had taken. Then we looked at the largest states in those schools, and we tried to determine whether or not we believe that they were in compliance with the state itself, or with the action that had been taken to try and limit DEI activities on college campuses. And so what we found is that most of them were not in compliance. And of course, most of the states who have moved to try and deal with this issue are red states. Left or blue states are not going to be taking action against this. They love this. They want more of this. And so that's not a direct complaint against any of these institutions, but then we publish a report, and they're also getting calls from national reporters asking if they're in compliance with these things. So this is a slightly different way of holding them accountable. A little less direct, but it's still a very important way. And I think it's also very important to us as an organization. We're not just after the big colleges and major universities. We do file complaints against them. We just filed one against the University of Alabama, I think Monday. And so, but we also, if there's small schools that are doing this, if they're junior colleges, no one's immune. No one's immune. And just because they're small doesn't mean that they are saved from our scrutiny. Because if it's wrong, it's wrong.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm so impressed with all you're doing and all you've accomplished in such a short period of time. Your concepts are really on target, and I've taken a few notes, so I may not stick to my scripted questions and dive into some of this stuff, but you did mention rebranding. So can you give us some examples? Because I've seen it in K-12. They have rebranded DEI with community and family engagement. And I've seen it in Texas, and I've seen it in South Carolina. And that's where I was clued that, okay, this is what the new name is going to be. And it's so far off from what it actually is. It's just absurd to me. So what's happening on the post-secondary level as far as the rebranding?
So yes, that's a great question, and one I love to talk about. It's we've watched this. So I wrote about this, Professor Jacobson and I wrote about this for Fox News almost 2 years ago, and the rebranding efforts. Once those acronyms started turning toxic. And so we found that they do a handful of things. As you mentioned, they'll just flat out rename things. On that, I think one of the most terrible things I've seen is that some of these schools are working to move DEI into disability offices. And I mean, to me, to try and treat this as something that would be under this particular office with people who have legitimate physical limitations is about as low as you can go, but they also believe that they would be untouchable there and far more shielded there. There's a lot. I actually just came from some meetings with other people who deal with this issue specifically, and the vulnerability that the whole disability thing provides or leaves open. That is one that I do think there is at least some legal ground to contest in the future. But just that they would even go that far, I think is terrible. We do see, like you said, accessibility, pluralism. There's also, we've noticed language changing in some of these programs where instead of them saying, explicitly limiting programs to certain ethnic groups or minority groups, that it would be something like historically disadvantaged. We see words like even pluralism, which I'm not quite sure where that's coming from, but I think those are kind of the things that we're seeing. But like I said, to my mind, the worst one, and the one that I find genuinely upsetting, truthfully, is the effort to try and move some of these programs and functions into the disability office and accessibility. And sometimes the accessibility is kind of disability light, but I think that that's mostly what we're seeing there. We know, I mean, we'd written about this too. There was a school, I think it was a satellite school of the University of Arkansas, that saw read the wind, and so preemptively made some changes. And so what they did is they took their DEI office, they took the funding, they took the people that they had in the office, and they just dispersed them into different offices, gave them different titles. We see that all the time. You see the same person with a different job title. Now that's where it becomes very, very difficult to track. That's where universities, that's where trustees, that's where, even state governance can help in terms of, coding these employment opportunities, to make it easier for us, people like us and organizations like us, to better assess where the money is going, where these people are, how that type of funding is being used. So, I mean, we see many things like that as well.
Well, that's interesting. I'm reminded also of the new legislation that's coming out to some of the legislation to close the Department of Education, where their solution is to just disperse it into other federal agencies. And we've told them, that's going to make it even more difficult for us to track what they're doing in those programs and the funding. So it's a common tactic, I believe, to kind of spread things out. They do it in education all the time, so it's difficult for us to follow. So, Kemberlee, we need to take a short break. But when we come back, I'd like to ask you about critical race training and the education database. So I'll be back with my interview with Kemberlee Kaye right after this. Unlocking a brighter future for education is within reach, and it only takes 4 simple steps with U.S. Parents Involved in Education's blueprint to establish state control of education. Today, let's explore the blueprint's first 2 steps. Step 1, discover the impact. Calculate the percentage of education spending that comes from the federal government in your state. Surprisingly, for most states, it's just around 10%. It may seem like a small fraction, but understanding its significance is key. Step 2, unravel the ties that bind. Conduct a cost of compliance study to reveal the hidden costs attached to federal dollars. Some districts have found innovative ways to replace federal programs, saving money and improving services. These 2 initial steps shed light on the delicate balance between federal funding and state control, showing how states have traded a lot of control for relatively little money. Join us next week for more insights into U.S. Parents Involved in Education. Visit uspie.org or connect with us at USPie on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. With me today is Kemberlee Kaye, Senior Contributing Editor at the Legal Insurrection Foundation. So tell me, Kemberlee, how has the Critical Race Training and Education database been used by parents, teachers, and policymakers to resist ideological indoctrination in schools?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for that. We've heard from many parents. We hear from state legislators. We hear from, I guess, the Beltway term is other stakeholders, right? People who are involved and engaged in trying to make a change in these efforts. My goal with the information we have, it's just publicly sourced information, you know, is to let people decide accordingly. We've actually heard from people and parents who love the DEI CRT stuff and have used our site to try and tease out which ones, may offer more of that. If that's their choice, fine. We're not in the business of limiting choice. We are in the business of transparency. And we are in the business of rooting out and exposing things that are divisive to our country, to our nation, the ideology that pits children against their parents and teaches this narrative of oppressor versus oppressee, just all kinds of outlandish and truly damaging things, that teaches children from a very young age to value other children by the color of their skin at an age where they're not really even aware that there are differences there. And so obviously those are values that we do not stand for. And so our goal with the CRT site is to provide as much information as possible so that parents can make well-informed decisions. And we've heard from many parents that have found it to be a wonderfully useful tool. I know that, as I've mentioned previously, that state lawmakers utilize our site as well to find out what's going on. We do like to attend conferences where there are many state lawmakers for that reason, to ensure that they're aware of the resource that we have. And so far, we've received a lot of feedback that it is very helpful. And I'm really excited about where we are now with this project. Like I mentioned before, where we're moving into more original research and reporting. And I actually have on my desk now a handful of reports to finalize that we'll be publishing in the very near future. And I'm really excited about that. And we'll continue to look into different windows of education. It doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional piece of education, because this stuff is everywhere. Just to give you an example, we thought it would, almost kind of as a joke, we decided to look into the top 10 veterinary schools, thinking surely, what good would this stuff be in veterinary education? Well, unfortunately, it was everywhere, and I think we just thought it was funny. We had a headline. We consider ourselves happy warriors. We deal with the gross all day long. But
so let me guess, are Cocker Spaniels oppressors?
yeah, I know, right? And but the way that the DEI has even infiltrated that, and how you deal with, I don't know, you call animals patients, but whatever, the animals caretakers or owners, and the considerations they need to make concerning the owners based on skin color and all of these kinds of things, which is just like, can you please help my dog with her skin allergy? I don't what does this matter? So it's been really interesting, and I wish I were not as surprised. And I guess maybe that's a expectation management on my side. I keep thinking surely there's some part of life or education or culture that it hasn't been tainted by this, and so far that has not been the case, unfortunately. But again, we really want to have good information so people can make informed decisions, and we put it out there in such a way. We will never do things. We're not going to rank the worst schools or give a list of the best schools, because that's not the purpose of the research. The purpose of the research is just open transparency, and again, it's accountability for these schools who are now, this has also been an interesting turn this year. We've had many schools contacting us demanding that we remove entries or their entire record from our database. And one of the things that we have done, and that we have, excuse me, that I think has been very interesting to see, is that we now have a historical database, because we've been tracking this for almost 5 years. We archive every link. So we really have an opportunity and a window into how this has changed over those years, which is not a long time, but it is a long time when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, and something that's moving and so fluid and moving so rapidly. Um, and my response to that is we maintain a historical database. So while we appreciate that you have taken efforts to dismantle this now, we'll make a note of it, but we're not going to remove our historical record, because it's very important to see as we continue down this journey what comes of it. You know, they may have removed it now, but as you and I know very well, that doesn't mean it's going to stay gone, you know?
Right.
So that's been something we've been dealing with lately too.
Okay, so you might not know, but our organization's mission is to close the U.S. Department of Education and end all federal education mandates. And we believe that's important beyond closing the Department of Ed, ending the federal influence. And we want to restore local and parental control to education. So I would ask you, in your view, how deeply entrenched is the federal influence in higher education through its grants and policies? And what would it take to truly unwind that system?
That's a wonderful question. And I mean, first, I want to say that I love that that's y'all's mission. I love that that's what you do. And that's what you're striving towards. We need so many more people that understand why that's necessary. I want to start with Trump's executive orders. And it's a drum that we've been beating, that I think we need to understand the purpose of the executive orders. And they targeted, to our minds, what is one of the biggest problems, which is the federal funding. And the executive orders themselves can't disband, can't, undo all the damage, can't deal with all of that. But it is a signal to the rest of the administration. It's a signal to Congress that this is what President Trump wants to do, that this is the messaging, this is where they're going, this is the end goal. I personally believe that the Department of Education is garbage and needs to go. So I'm right there with you. Nothing good has come of it since it's been invented. In fact, we've seen nothing but harm being done since the advent and implementation of the education department. There are a handful of things. I know I mentioned earlier that we work with the Department of we don't work with the Department of Education, but we utilize a mechanism available through their Office of Civil Rights in order to file complaints. And of course, should the Department of Education disband completely, and I hope it does, we would like that function to remain intact, because it's tremendously helpful in being able to file complaints on behalf of people anonymously so that they're not individually targeted. And so we have many thoughts and ideas about ways to preserve that. It could be as simple as moving that mechanism to the Department of Justice to allow them to oversee that, or moving it back to HHS, where I believe it was before being moved into education. But it's really the funding. And I think Professor Jacobson actually was talking to Fox News about this yesterday. And he hit the nail on the head. He was talking about how we've done this for years. We followed higher education. He's still a clinical law professor at Cornell's Law School. So he's deeply entrenched in all of this. And so we know that funding is the biggest, feeder here. That's the only reason these things are able to subsist with the strength in which they do. But we didn't realize the degree to which funding was involved in this, nor did we realize the degree to which we were paying for all of this, all of the DEI consulting, all of the entire ecosystem that's essentially taxpayer funded. And so, and this is something we do kind of go back and forth with, because, I think in some ways he would like to disband all of the humanities. I'm a humanities kid, grown up now, I guess. I love the humanities. I educate my children using a classical model. I understand that this is very, very important. I also understand it's a vulnerability in the system where, so much of this ideology has infiltrated higher education through the humanities. And there are many policy remedies for that, and I won't get into the weeds there. But ultimately, kind of to square the circle, it comes to the funding. And if we're able to cut off the funding to these programs, it dies on the vine. And it can't just be a direct cut to the funding on the federal level. It has to be, and I think which was a strategically brilliant move that they started with USAID. They could have started, with the Fed. They could have started with the Pentagon. They could have started anywhere. But they intentionally went in to blow off the lid of the waste, fraud, and abuse so people could see where our money's going, and to find out the extent to which our money is funding programs that are hostile, not just not quite in alignment, but that are downright hostile to American interests, to the interests of our country and our value system, traditionally, has been really interesting. And so it's our view that ultimately you can do many other things. You can disband and move functions to different agencies, but I don't really want many functions moved. I want them gone, right? Like that's the goal, to get rid of as much as of the existing structure as possible. But it really comes back to the funding. And I think if the administration and if Congress is able to get it together and actually take some kind of action on their side to solidify and codify those funding changes, I think we will see a dramatic turn of events. It's really, and I am a huge proponent of federalism. I don't think the states are equipped to have this thrown back in their laps. I think the states are used to the federal funding. The universities are used to the federal funding. So I think we would definitely see a very large or pretty lengthy period of adjustment as, how then do these institutions continue to exist in their current form? I think the answer is they wouldn't. So then what does that look like next? But that's kind of going a little bit beyond your question. But ultimately, too long didn't read. Funding. It is the funding.
Well, we couldn't agree more, and you've really opened my eyes to some of the vision you have on that, especially how they went after the UN aid and blew the top off that, as you said, so that people could see how money is being wasted, how their tax dollars were funding these things. And I believe by and large, most taxpayers don't agree with the things that you're uncovering that are being paid for. So a couple of things that you brought up. First of all, we have a blueprint that we published in 2018. We actually updated it recently and reprinted it. And we've circulated that all around the country. We're talking with some congressmen who are using it to craft legislation. But one of the things we put in there as far as transferring the programs to other agencies, as I mentioned, we're not a fan of that. However, the Office of Civil Rights is one that we did say that should be transferred to the Department of Justice. So that was our recommendation, and it was good to hear that you agree with that concept. It is a needed program, but it doesn't need to be funded or placed in the Department of Education. I think it would fit perfectly in the mission and the work of the Department of Justice. Another thing I thought about just quickly, and then we're going to have to take a short break, but with the complaints you've been filing with the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, we learned, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago now, that the president formed a task force with the Department of Education and the Department of Justice working together to expedite the review of these complaints, because typically it takes quite a while from what I've heard. So I know you're probably happy about that step, but just tell us briefly about how that's going to impact and assist and aid in your work.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we were very excited to hear that as well. We have complaints that we filed 2 years ago that are still pending. And of course, the best case scenario for all of these is that the federal government opens an investigation into these programs. And we're very careful in how we capture information and how we log information and how we cover information so that it is forever, because the internet is forever, and we make sure that, we keep the receipts, as they say, right? But the best case scenario is that we have a thoughtful department who opens investigations. The only concern I do have, while I appreciate the task force, is that they've also laid off something like 92% of their attorneys. So I'm not sure how quickly they'll be able to get through some of these complaints. But I'm hopeful that with this consolidation and this focus, I mean, and I'm sure you are just as well aware of how bureaucracy works and how the federal government works. Sometimes if you have just the 8% focused on one thing, they can accomplish, exponentially more than the rest of the 92% that they then laid off. So, tiny bit concerned about that, but really hopeful that they're really focused on this mission. And it would be wonderful for us because ultimately what we're looking for, we're not filing complaints just to file a complaint. I want change. I want there to be some kind of consequence for these universities who knowingly and willingly engage or support programs, scholarships, whatever they are, that are in direct violation of the Equal Protection Clause. That's not okay. And I want justice there. I do. I'm very justice driven individual, and I want to see justice there, and I want to see change, and I want to see consequence so that maybe they'll think twice. And I know that they will then go back to the drawing board and come up with another approach, and that's fine. We'll deal with that when it happens. But at least that this ultimately puts an end to what they're trying to do now.
That's great. I love your passion and your motivation. I'm also justice driven, and it can get us in trouble sometimes, but we absolutely need warriors like you out there who are seeking justice and holding people accountable, and especially when it comes to our tax dollars and children. We need to take another short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you 2 questions that I ask all my guests before closing the show. So don't go away. I'll be right back with my interview with Kemberlee Kaye right after this. U.S. Parents Involved in Education has developed a transformative initiative, the Blueprint to Establish State Control of Education, which outlines the gradual elimination of all federal education dollars. Last week, we addressed the first 2 steps, calculating federal spending in your state and conducting a cost of compliance study. Today, we unfold steps 3 and 4. Step 3. Identify and eliminate programs lacking effectiveness, necessity, or efficiency. Strategically replace them with state-centric alternatives, unbound by external scrutiny. Step 4. Redirect education revenue responsibilities back to the state. Instead of channeling state taxpayer funds to the federal government only to receive them with strings attached, the Blueprint provides tax strategies to retain these funds within the state. For further insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education, visit USPI.org or connect with us at USPI on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. With me today is Kemberlee Kaye, Managing Editor of CriticalRace.org. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kemberlee. This has been a very insightful conversation. I'm going to review it a few times and take a few notes because I've learned today. So I'm so glad that we've had this opportunity. So I'd like to ask you the 2 questions that I always ask my guests before we end. And the first one is, what are some of your concerns? And then if you could follow up with things you're optimistic about.
Sure, I love that. I love ending on a positive note. I love that. So I do have concerns. I homeschool my children. And of course, I'm raising small children in a very turbulent world. I have concerns about what this looks like for them down the road. I have concerns about whether, the model that we've had for generations where you graduate high school, you go to college, and then you go on to do something. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know that that would make sense for them, given what we know is happening on campuses ideologically across the board. That's a concern of mine. I am very concerned that we live in a culture that's increasingly hostile to men and masculinity, especially as someone raising a son. That's something I'm very aware of, is protecting who he is and how he was designed and created to be, in a world that just doesn't make any room for that. So those are things that concern me. What I am optimistic about is that I'm optimistic that God is still on the throne. I'm optimistic that our hope is in him and it's not in any president or policy or government agency change. I am very optimistic, so I'm a little bit insulated in some ways. And then I live in a small town in Texas. I've decamped from large city living a few years ago. Best decision I ever made. But I'm very optimistic about the fact that even though it's not widely represented in media, that there has been a massive swing among people my age and even younger towards a more traditional life. And I can say, at least for us, for the community that we have here, we're an entire, I would say, like crunchy community. I don't even know what word people would use to describe it, but of parents and families deeply invested in the well-being of their children and in making sure that their childhood is protected, their innocence is protected, their bodies are protected, whether it's from chemicals in food or chemicals in water, and trying to do the best that we can to give them a very analog childhood and lifestyle, where they have plenty of time to grow as children, to grow in the Lord, where the natural development of things is encouraged, not discouraged, where they're not getting punished for being children. And just this sort of resurgence of all things holistic, all things simple, all things good. That's something that I'm very encouraged by. Even a swing towards younger people's politically, towards younger people's being, involved in a church, or some kind of activity of that kind. I'm encouraged by those things. And I think we know, obviously, that what the media presents and portrays is not always accurate to what's happening on the ground, whether that's politically, culturally, or otherwise. But I do see such a groundswell of this, of younger people getting married and wanting to have a family and wanting to have children, of mothers wanting to be mothers first and staying with their children when possible, and so many things like that, that I am encouraged despite everything we see. Again, my faith, hope, and trust is not in anything here, but is always in the Lord and his word and his promises. But that there's always good no matter where we are. And ultimately, we can choose to sit back and just watch things happen, or we can jump in and do what we can in our sphere. And it is a note of encouragement that I always like to leave people, is that you don't have to get involved at the federal level. I mean, if every person just worked on their own sphere, I mean, whether it's attending a school board meeting or attend a city council meeting, or, if you see a need, even forget about the political aspect of this. If you see a need in your community, don't wait for someone else, be the someone else and step in that gap and just be a help, be the change. And I know, again, that's super trite and very kitschy, but it's true. If everyone would just try and put in a little bit of good, I think we would have a very different world. So that's what I have this morning.
That's awesome, Kimberly. I really appreciate you sharing your heart like that. And you're certainly a great role model for other young women your age. And you're probably around the age of my daughter-in-law, who is a co-host on our show. And she has very similar desires. They have a 5-acre farm, and she homeschools her children, and they raise chickens. And, it's beautiful. And they're preserving their children's innocence. And she's also active. She's active through our organization and through local politics, doing what she can. So thank you for being that good role model for young women your age. And I'm sure it's going to impact many of our viewers. So I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast, Kimberly, and thank you for all the work you're doing. And just tell us before we go how people can find out more about the Legal Insurrection Foundation.
Sure. And thank you so much for your time, and thank you for reaching out. I've really enjoyed being able to share what we do, and very much admire everything that y'all do as well. But you can find us at the Legal Insurrection, or just legalinsurrectionfoundation.com. Our blog is legalinsurrection.com. Our map and all of our research on CRT and DEI and higher education can be found at criticalrace.org. And then the work that we do with the Equal Protection Project can be found at equalprotect.org.
Great. Really awesome work that you're doing. Thank you all for listening and supporting our work, and join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, U.S. PIE seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional U.S. PIE chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.